Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity today. My name is Rachael Whitehair, Director of Innovation and Stewardship with the Nebraska Corn Checkoff. So my role is to oversee the production research and sustainability programs on behalf of Nebraska's more than 21,000 corn producers. So before we dive in here today on the discussion, I did want to begin with just a brief primer to set our stage. Perhaps. Oop. Okay, so we'll start here. Very common scene you hear at sea in Nebraska, or Iowa for that matter. This panel today seeks to highlight two aspects of corn, that is potential and sustainability. Now, when you look at the corn kernel, there are endless opportunities there for further processing. That's been highlighted several times today, and we're certainly going to reiterate that aspect. This kernel finds its way into more than 4,000 products today. And we consider ourselves to be in this golden age of innovation, meaning that we are producing more with less. Most notably, they're looking at our drastic increases in yield potential and the land that may spare for production as a result. Now, looking more towards global production, our world produces about 2.7 trillion pounds of corn. That's a lot. And the US, we're about a third of that production. So aptly named when many folks consider this region the Corn Belt. Now, looking at corn supply and demand, you can see that the last couple of decades, we've seen year over year pretty much a trend upwards in utilization. And that's positive, but then you see at the top there, that blue section, that's surplus. So that stocks to use. More than 2 billion bushels of corn still find themselves needing a home. And so production, while that's continuing to improve, and demand is as well, we are still at top of mind considering that utilization and opportunities for demand are key. That is at top of mind for both industry and producers alike. Now, production efficiency is akin to sustainability. So most notably, nationally here in the US, in the last 45 years or so, we have seen corn production improve by more than 40% in areas of soil loss, land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as energy utilization. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to my panelists and we'll have some introductions.
Yeah, I'm Mark McHargue, fourth generation farmer, about 120 miles west of here. I also serve as Vice President of Nebraska Farm Bureau. I appreciate being here. I look forward to a very robust discussion about one of the things that almost everybody in this room is going to touch, and that's the feedstock for the bioeconomy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Buck. I am the Director of Industrial Innovation for the Iowa Corn Checkoff. I develop new plastics, chemicals, fuels on behalf of Iowa's corn farmers.
To round it out, I'm Reid Wagner, Executive Director of the Nebraska Ethanol Board. We've been a state agency since the 70s before we had any ethanol production of commodity scale. But we've been part of this whole build out and we're always looking for what that next step is, and it all starts with the golden kernel.
Wonderful. Well, gentlemen, we've described corn as limitless in this panel description, yet industry faces growing demand and some resource challenges. So from your perspectives, how is the corn world innovating and adapting to ensure sustainable volumes of production well into the future in regards to both the farm and the bioprocessing perspective?
I think the main change that's going on right now, for at least farming, would be precision farming and precision ag. I know a lot of chemical companies are asking about the traceability of their products, and while the industry in Nebraska, Iowa, and the rest of the Midwest for processing is looking to track those sorts of things. Farmers have data. They've been doing this for decades in some cases with variable rates coming on recently, variable rate planting and everything else. But really understanding where every kernel is, every step taken to nurture that kernel, that baby plant to grow into what we have today, has been a major push in order to ensure that we're lowering the use of pesticides, fertilizers, and using them more responsibly.
You know, I'll just speak from our farm. We've been in existence for probably almost 70 years. I've been on the farm for almost 40 years. And in the last 20 years, we've probably doubled our production on the exact same acres that my dad had been farming for 30 years prior to me. And I think that's always interesting because it's the exact same soil, the same water, the same air, but because of production practices, and I'd say largely genetics have really changed the game on the ability to handle stress better. And so it has been dry. You know, we talk about climate change, and there are wetter areas and drier areas, but one of the things I've heard consistently across the country, not only Nebraska, but my counterparts across the country, is that when it's been dry, the common theme is that at harvest, I can't believe how well the yield was relative to the amount of moisture we had. I think that's largely due production practices, but genetics played a pretty big role in that as well.
And just on the downstream processing side, just kind of thinking about, you know, Mark, you talk about doubling your production with your operation. The ethanol plants, you know, over time have gone anywhere from yields of 2.5 gallons or so per bushel of corn, up pushing above 3 now. We've seen so many innovations and with so many of the great partners you've seen on the stage through enzymes and different types of chemical inputs or, you know, different yeast strains, things like that over time have been able to push us and processing efficiencies to these high yields. And it's kind of interesting because, I mean, Corn Board kind of tracks how much of that ethanol or, you know, how much of our corn product is actually used within our ethanol plants. It's about a third, 33 to 35% in the state. And so you might think that's kind of a counteracting measure there, but we've been able to really start to extend and expand into different markets, obtaining higher shares of the gas tank. But now we're looking, of course, beyond that. Instead of just being, you know, well to wheel, let's talk about field to fuselage, right? Let's go find ourselves in maybe some aircraft, find ways that we could decarbonize other sectors. And so as practitioners of the infrastructure on the processors, those are the types of opportunities we're truly looking for. So this is kind of a really exciting time for our infrastructure and trying to harness some of those opportunities. And so those are the innovations that are on the horizon to continue to track with Mark's doubling production. We want to be able to move lockstep in terms of grinding more corn and creating more low carbon products for everybody to use.
Of course, the frontier is eventually ethanol to all the different chemicals. It's an excellent platform molecule. The petrochemical industry was built on ethane and ethylene. Well, ethanol is one step removed from ethylene. And so that's the ultimate future. Sustainable aviation fuels go through ethylene in the first place when they're using from ethanol. So if we build that as a platform chemical for lots of chemistries, all the plastics, the tops, you know, if you think about the recyclable numbers of all the plastics, all except for one of them in those recycling triangles you see have some sort of ethylene input into them.
Yeah, and you can't leave off, of course, the developments on the feed side too, being able to move beyond our conventional cattle on feed into different specialty, different types of ingredients that would go into aquaculture or different kinds of, you know, varieties of and strains of different livestock across the multiple states and then internationally too. So that's another way that we have been able to keep up demand on that front by bringing value back to the processing side.
Now, I did hear the mention of the recycling triangle, and we have kind of a unique depiction here in Nebraska we call the golden triangle. And I wonder if our Nebraska natives might speak to that a little bit.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not overly, Nebraska is not a lot different than, you know, some of the surrounding states around us, but because of our aquifer, we do have considerable water and really good water here in Nebraska. But when you think about the complete production cycle, when we bring ethanol into the sector, or biofuels, there was a lot of conversation about food versus fuel. Well, that really didn't end up being an issue at all, quite frankly, because we have the ability to create a lot of things out of the kernel that just was in front of you. And we've had the ability to split that kernel out, just like we do molecules and other types of systems. We can do that with the corn. And so we have the ability to create ethanol or biofuels. The second part of that goes to the livestock sector. And we on our farm, we have a livestock operation in hogs, and we can feed almost 20% of the distiller's grains to the hogs. On the corn side, on the distiller's grain for the cattle, it's really almost a better product now for the cattle feed, and part of that, and then it comes back full circle around. So it's really a sustainable. We don't hardly talk about the triangle anymore. It's really actually a sustainable circle, and that's what's so exciting about this conversation, is that we don't have to give up something in order to gain something on the bioeconomy. We are actually being additive to this kernel of corn and being able to sustain multiple entities for both people in Nebraska and around the country.
I think your comment about misconception about food versus fuel is a good one, but also I think it continues on about some of those other misconceptions you can run into at times about GMOs, for example, that you had mentioned earlier, that some of those could be benefiting your management practices and growing your yield. But I also think that GMOs and some of these other genetic traits that you have can enable land management practices. Because when you think about the requests from brands and large companies are looking for no-till or strip-till or minimal tillage in the field, you think about how that cover that's being left over by the stalks are making a nice microbiome for earthworms, but it's also making a nice microbiome for corn rootworm and other pests. And so by having genetic traits that only affect the insects and the negative pests that feed on the corn, you're not being forced to apply pesticides which kill all insects. It's only killing ones that are affecting it, and then can enable positive land management practices. So I think that helps build those circularities that we're seeing how it's improving that circle. It's making it more sustainable through a technology that originally came with a misconception.
Very well said. And I might add a great segue into our next question. So today we see a much larger focus from our value-added industry to prove sustainability within their supply chain, often beginning with that feedstock. So what do you see as the most significant misconceptions surrounding sustainable farming practices, and how can we better educate consumers and stakeholders about the benefits and trade-offs of different approaches?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we've bumped into, and we even kind of see it creeping into some of the rules and regulations we're starting to see with people implementing, not to get into too much alphabet soup, but 45Z and some of the low carbon tax credits, is that this stuff is simple, that a farmer can adopt this for the right price necessarily, but it's very complex and regional. And before I get completely out of school, these guys can talk to that. But the fact that, you see a lot of people coming in saying, well, everybody can do a cover crop, right? No problem. That's not necessarily the case. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we kind of deal with, is just general education of the true innovation of ag and how it looks in different corners of every state in the Corn Belt. If you guys want to maybe speak to some of that.
Yeah, as a fourth generation, my son being the fifth generation, I think as you guys are looking with people to partner with, you have the tax credit side, you have the federal side, but you also have the private side. And if you're on the private side, I would encourage you to partner with people that know and understand the land and have been on the land for generation after generation. And there's nobody that can actually better steward that land than those that have been operating that land for years. For instance, it goes against the regenerative conversation a little bit. We have a piece of property that has been corn on corn for 60 years. 60 years. And we will have the best crop off of that that we've probably ever grown this year. Well, some would say, well, that's nearly impossible if you listen to all the rhetoric on sustainable and regenerative. But we understand that particular farm. We know what it needs, and we know how to operate it. You could take that same farm, maybe do some practices that maybe make a check mark for 45Z, and it may have a higher carbon footprint at the end of the day because you're doing practices that don't really fit that particular property. And so I would say just be careful around the conversation. that we look at the end goal of wanting to grow crops sustainably at a price that's affordable, that can keep the farmers on the ground and on the property and be profitable. At the same time, we'll provide a really high quality product that really is environmentally friendly, and there's a lot of different ways to do that.
I think these two covered it pretty well. The only thing I'll add was to Reid's comment about some people might say you can do cover crops on all land. You know, when we take it to the lab that many of you are working in whether it's fermentation or thermocatalysis or any types of lab experiments you're doing, you know, if I told you you have to go use this enzyme or you have to go use this solvent, you'd say, oh, well, I don't think I can, but you'd go test it, right? You'd see, well, maybe I could. Let's find out if I can. Well, Mark here, if he's, 40 years, that's 40 crops, that's 40 experiments, right, on that 1 acre. And so if you do an experiment over here on these acres and there's a hailstorm, well, that's not a good data point. So you got to come back, you got to do it again. Or if it floods, that's not a good data point. And so when it comes to the land management practices, you have to remember that the experiments, the tests to further and get better at some of these things, farmers have a different time scale because we get 1 experiment a year on that 1 acre.
And Alex, I just add to that is that the geography in our country is immense. And so just from our county, you go 20 miles north, they farm a little differently than 20 miles south. And I think that's when we get into, when we start talking about regenerative and sustainable practices, it has to be relative to that actual region. That region can vary within even a handful of miles on soils. And so again, we need to be practical about the conversation, but realizing that we all need to understand the end goal. And that's one of the things that I get to do as Farm Bureau president, is really have that conversation with the broad scope of agriculture and encouraging them to really look at the next thing and how really the bioeconomy can fit well into their farming practice.
I don't want to derail you too fast, Rachel.
That's all right. You go right ahead.
Mark talks about soils. When I talk to companies and brands about understanding what's going on with the farmer, I don't know how many soil types you have. Some of my farmers tell me they have 20 different soil types on their farm. There are 20,000 soil types in the United States. What does that mean to you? What if you had 20,000 different materials of construction for your reactors, for different things, right? It's not going to work on all chemistries. Hastelloy steel or 316 steel or zirconium metal aren't going to work for all chemistries, and it's not going to work for all land that Mark or any other farmers has. So you have to let them try it and find out if that material of construction is actually going to work, or that soil is actually going to work for that land practice you're asking for.
Another piece I want to touch on is the time scale of change that was alluded to a little bit here. You know, on a typical farm, whether it be Nebraska or Iowa, most of these are family owned. More than 90% of the farms in Nebraska are still family owned. And so there is that growing misconception out there from the end consumer that a lot of what is developed on the landscape is from these big production farms that are owned by these massive companies, and it's just not the case. And oftentimes it is, a father, a son, a wife, a mother. It's a team of like 2 to 5 people that are running thousands and thousands of acres. And so, enacting a massive change that incurs tens of thousands of dollars worth of risk and could make or break that 1-year experiment is really not a light consideration. One other piece that I think is important, especially in regards to Nebraska and then also our Kansas neighbors, is the topic of irrigation. So in Nebraska, about half of our acres are irrigated, but it accounts for more than 60% of our production. And there's a huge growing misconception out there that irrigated production is less efficient, is more heavy greenhouse gas-wise, has a higher carbon intensity, and it is just that, a misconception. Like Mark noted too, we are uniquely positioned above the Ogallala Aquifer. It's an amazing resource that allows us to produce such highly because of irrigated production. As you move west, there's a drastic reduction in rainfall, and there just isn't the ability to produce that much corn from rain-fed. But because we can irrigate, we can produce a sustainable amount of bushels year over year, and our production efficiency can skyrocket. So, you know, you have a higher sustained yield over that same level of inputs, therefore driving down that CI score. And so we actually find that our irrigated producers tend to have a lower average CI score than our dryland producers. So our next question for you guys. Corn is well positioned to thrive in a circular bioeconomy environment. What opportunities and challenges do you see on the horizon?
You want me to jump in? You know, I kind of alluded to it, but we talked about some of the incentive structures that are being worked on from the Inflation Reduction Act and other policies in the U.S. federal government. You know, I think there's one challenge in that we don't have guidance yet. We're waiting on a lot of those things to, you know, really unlock the producer's capability to become part of this carbon emissions reduction goal, right? And there's a lot baked into the modeling required for that. There's been a lot of requests for information from the USDA. And, you know, and one interesting challenge from, you know, the ethanol production side is the making sure that the ownership of data and the verification is strong and it's correct, because the ethanol producers do not want to be, you know, the police over the level of sustainability or the full verification of your particular crop. You know, we want that to be really strong and something that the farmers can also hold for themselves in terms of data security. You know, most of our boards of many of our ethanol plants are comprised of farmers, so they know very well that that data means a significant amount to them. So as these new opportunities arise, data security is going to be a challenge, making sure that we can walk through this safely and making sure that everybody can, you know, provide value for that ag product in the most robust and sustainable way for their operation.